Back in the days of old, before tractors and combine harvesters did much of the work, farmers would work the land by hand. Interestingly enough, Jason Knight from Modern History TV theorizes that the term acre was once meant how much land one man could work with a scythe in one day, and could be used for a gauge as to how many men were needed for the job of harvesting, or how long that job would take. But even back then, they had help from animals to work the land, pulling ploughs, hauling stumps, logging, or just drawing the cart to market. According to many biblically minded people, every animal has a purpose, be it for work, food, carcass management, or just companionship. As a dog lover, I can understand that. But does the Bible support this? Is any of this really just cultural norms, or is it based in deeper past habits? And more importantly, does this stack up with what we know about animals today? This is the question I'll be looking at in this video, as we continue to explore the animals of God's world. It's often best to start at the beginning and see what the animals had to do at the start of it all. Genesis 1 has a number of passages about the animals, but verse 26 stands out in this regard, where God says this: Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all creatures that move along the ground." This implies that man was created to have control over all animals on the earth. However, later in Genesis 2, it implies that animals were made in order to find a suitable helper, which can mean two things. First, a work helper to look after the land, which, if so, makes it seem that we're ignoring women and have been for many generations. I mean, back in the day, women did most of the housework and not help with the land at all. Why? If that's what they were made for originally. Second, the help of the species, which goes down some very dark roads I'm not even going to contemplate this. Regardless, it seems animals were made for man's purpose, be it he who is made to rule, or them made for him to rule. What these purposes are is a hard one to decide, since apparently mankind could make clothes out of leaves quite early on, but God gave them animal skins clothing not long afterwards, in Genesis 3:21. So it seems like he's not entirely against animals being killed for clothing. They are later given as food for mankind in Genesis 9:3. Everything that lives and moves will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you all things. Before that, however, he seemed happier with an animal offering than a plant-based offering, as shown in Genesis 4, when Abel sacrificed a lamb to him, and it was well received, unlike Cain's offering a crop. Which is interesting, since Adam had been told by God to work the land for his food after the fall, and that's what he did. Only for Abel to turn up less than a generation later. We're not given a timeline at all for that. And he tended to farm animals. He gave a fresh lamb to sacrifice to God. Many animals are sacrificed to God over the course of the Old Testament, including bulls, cows, birds, lambs, and goats. So it seems God isn't afraid of man to hunt and kill animals for food or just sacrifice. However, this idea gets knocked back quite some way by the food laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, because many animals are named as unclean, including the predatory birds, the carrion birds, bats, unscaled fish, most insects, lizards, and even odd-toed ungulate. So, why is this? Why does God change his mind so late in time? Particularly after he said, "Don't worry, you can eat whatever you want after the flood." Some of these make sense, since meat eaters aren't good to eat due to a high level of vitamin A in their livers. Plus, I've heard it said it goes into the old ways, which technically involves not interfering with hunters, be it by killing them or eating their kills. However, being picky about the ungulates makes it harder to understand, because it specifically allows for those that chew the cud, which means those who had to regurgitate solid food in order to re-chew it, allowing to process it a bit more. Now, this isn't a pleasant sight, and I'm pretty sure most people who don't understand what it's about would think it is very unclean, it's absolutely disgusting. Yet, it doesn't put off the Israelites. Personally, I think that it's possible these animals were far easier to hunt, like the deer, or just more efficient to farm for food, because they would be eating so much grass, wouldn't be eating so much crops, and later on won't be eating so much silage, and hence make it cheaper to feed them, thus making them more favourable in the herds that were brought to the promised lands. As for some of the insects, grasshoppers and their kin are tough little things, but it's important to remember that if left unchecked, they can go into plagues which can tear through crops, which might explain why they were seen as clean to eat. Because otherwise, they just come tearing through and your crops are gone. If you learn to eat them, well, you're allowed to eat them, that means you lower the population. As I'm not entirely sure what animals eat them, I'm pretty sure there wouldn't be enough of them in Israel at the time. Let's do some research on that. Most other winged insects, like butterflies, bees, and even some wasps, are pollinators and therefore should be left in peace. Horned animals in the regions, like most of the mammals, tend to be predators and so fall under the same arch as the meat eating birds, because you eat their meat, if you hit the liver, then you'll die of vitamin A poisoning. Similar to the lizards, but that could also be because lizards, for the most part, aren't that large, and so don't really have much meat on them. The exception being monitor lizards, which are venomous. So most of them make a bit of sense, but there are three that don't really make a lot of sense at first, until you study them. Firstly, the camel. Now, camels, they are big, big beefy creatures, and dried camel meat is quite tasty. But bear in mind they're mostly leg, and you've got a load of animals that are mostly, well, wool and meat. Why are you going to go for something that is easily capable of lasting a long time in the desert and strolling across it with ease, hence could carry a lot more stuff, hence carry you a lot further? They are the ideal pack animals. So what's the point of killing it for food? Because it's such a big creature that you'll have to have another animal set aside to carry the meat. And in that case, why are you bothering killing an animal just for its meat? You got plenty more. Stick with them. Pigs are often used in many things today, resulting in them being far more used dead than alive. One of the few things that they do when living is truffle hunting, but that is rare and can be done by dogs. So why are pigs seen as bad? Yes, they don't chew they don't chew the cud, and once they have divided feet, that is the least of their worries. And certainly later on, they're said to constantly wallow in mud. But that isn't a problem. Not really. Keeps them clean. Pigs are remarkably clean animals. They don't wallow in their own muck. But I dug around, taking a look, and I found some studies that show that consumption of pig meat is correlated with a large number of diseases and conditions. Several viruses, which I can't pronounce their names, I'll see if I can find the pronunciation for them later. Tapeworms, they're common. But there's also heart disease, cirrhosis of the liver, hepatitis B, C, and E, and apparently multiple sclerosis. Other sites suggest cancers of the bowel and liver, but since that's referring to processed meat, I'm not sure that applies here because I think food processing on that level really came around in more recent centuries rather than back then. Now, my research hasn't gone into the depths that Carl Hill would like, and I'm skeptical about some of the sites I've been researching since they all seem to be either vegan or very kosher based. But all things considered, pork based foods are not the best option for long term consumption. Since God is aware of things in the future, this explains a lot. So, regardless of what people say, God having foreknowledge is actually a useful thing here. Horses aren't mentioned in this list at all, but due to their historical uses, all the way back from antiquity to early modern times. I mean, very recently horses have been pretty much retired from active duties, including the military, farming, and even active work in the police. Well, they're still using the police sometimes. It's not unreasonable for people just to use horses, mules, or donkeys as pieces of burden. Plus, if you're going to use the horse, why kill it? It's much better as a ride. Stick with that. Now, I know some people say, but the horseman discount, does that go against kosherness? Well, you got to remember one thing. Christ pretty much proved that God is practical. So, essentially, if you must eat something, and the only animal that turns up happens to be something that's not kosher, just eat it. If, say, for example, you're starving and a young horse comes limping over, clearly about to die, help it out, and don't forget to thank God for. I won't be happy with it. I'm a horse lover, but seriously, don't be afraid to eat anything that isn't considered kosher if you're starving. And someone once said, "There's not much eating in religion." Well, what about animals that die naturally? Well, Deuteronomy 4:21 has an interesting passage about this. Do not eat anything you find already dead. You may give it to the foreigner residing in any of your towns, and they may eat it, or you may sell it to any other foreigner. But you are a people holy to the Lord your God. This implies that eating roadkill is frowned upon, but you can give it to others outside the laws of the faith. Whilst that is interesting and certainly runs into all manner of ideas about whether you're giving foreigners poisoned food or not, it shows that God doesn't want to have things wasted. This, however, seems to strike an interesting discord with two more passages. Firstly, from Leviticus 11, which heavily implies touching anything to do with something unclean and dead is resulted in being unclean and should be broken or washed until sunset. Which sounds a lot like cross contamination. So that seems to harmonise with that, surely. Except it's knocked back by Judges 14, which tells the story of Samson and the lion. For those who don't know, Samson was attacked by a lion, so he tore the lion in half with his bare hands and left it in the field, only to return sometime later to find that bees had nested in it and started making honey. This is never explained. Well, I certainly haven't found anyone to explain it. Samson took the honey from the dead lion. Whether the fact that the spirit filled him with energy to kill the lion, or thus making it a natural death, or Samson killed him, thus it was his kill, isn't explained. But I'm guessing it was Samson's kill, so it implies that he can do what he wants. Therefore, he can touch the lion to remove the honey that he needs. This will make for an interesting riddle later on. Deuteronomy 14:21 also implied that dead animals are still to be eaten, but not by the Israelites, showing that little is to be wasted, regardless of who eats it. However, this doesn't seem to be the case with one law made in Exodus 21, verse 28. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. Quite apart from the fact that stoning a bull to death is a bit like trying to take on a Rottweiler with a Nerf gun. Though I think they would have used a stone axe rather than actually pebble, since stone axes would have been used in Egypt at the time and might have even been allowed to be carried by the Hebrew slaves. This heavily implies that the meat is going to waste. Granted, there are enough predators around that would make the bull carcass at least serviceable and they would eat it, but it will lead to predators following the Israelites through the wilderness. This is a worry for the rest of the livestock that they would have to be herding, and they would have to be livestock, otherwise they wouldn't survive in the desert very long. And in fact, why would they bother mentioning all the livestock in the food laws if they weren't bringing them with them? I need to look at that passage and figure it out. But one thing to bear in mind, a reason why I have no intention of going vegan is because of what we're going to do with the animals. Learn about Alice the camel situation. Call it. For those of you who don't know, all the wild cows in Australia, they're feral, they're not native. They were let loose by people who didn't want to kill their camels when the roads were built and railways were running. So they let them out into the wild, and now they're a real problem. They literally have to hunt them down. And what do you do when you hunt an animal? You have to eat the meat. As there are no predators in Australia big enough to take on dingoes, maybe? But you need quite a few dingoes, and they're most of them just go to the koalas. You can see where that's going. Same here in Britain. We don't have enough wild animals to take on cows. So personally, I think if we just let cows roam free, they're just going to devastate the countryside because they'll be unchecked. Same with sheep and goats. Mind you, they got a bit more of a chance because they're smaller and can be taken down by eagles. But unless we reintroduce wolves to Britain, we can't release all the cows. So it seems many animals have been marked as eatable, and many more have been blacklisted from the kosher menu. Some of this because they are given a purpose, and God gives those laws to allow this to be the case. But what are those purposes? Trying to pin down what God's purpose is a bit like trying to pin down what it is that makes fire so beautiful for mankind. I just picked that out of my head. I really don't know why I came up. But it's that sort of nebulous thing. So is there anything in the Bible that can help us out in this regard? Well, there seems to be quite a few actually. And I'll list them off as best I can. I'll try and leave the references in the description below. But Genesis 22:13, a ram was caught in a thicket, so Abraham could sacrifice it instead of his son Isaac when God asked him to test his trust in God. Judges 14, a lion attacked Samson and became a metaphor for being powerful but gentle, was strong and sweet. In Genesis 9, both doves and ravens were sent to find land when the rains had ceased, and ravens again brought food to Elijah in the first book of Kings, chapter 7, verse 4. Second book of Kings, chapter 2, verse 24, spoke of bears responding to a curse in the Lord's name and killing 40 or more bullying boys. Jonah chapter 1:17 tells the classic tale of Jonah being swallowed by a whale, or a big fish, no one really agrees on this, and taken to where he needs to go when he tries to run the other way. Going out of specific mentions, donkeys are constantly mentioned as humble animals compared to the high-stepping horses common amongst the rich and powerful. And in apocryphal texts, such as the infant Gospel of Thomas, dragons are said to bow down before Jesus. Though I think in this case Thomas is actually referring to lizards. And of course in Revelation, the 4 living creatures of heaven were constantly praising God forevermore. And if we're to talk about animals responding to God, let us remember that many, many animals came to the ark before the flood happened. And if we're to take it literally that every living thing on earth comes to the ark, that would mean they would have to cross thousands of miles to reach Mesopotamia. I mean, kangaroos, they can shift, but that's going a bit far, surely. Literally skipping across Africa, it's madness. So, animals respond to God and His will and serve His purposes in a broad manner of speaking. Since we can, in theory, presume that God's ultimate purpose is for a pure life on earth, helping out humans in a few small ways isn't too much to ask for. I mean, if Abraham wasn't able to sacrifice anything to God save his son Isaac, that would certainly raise a few questions about his character and make him think darker, and many more besides. So to say every animal on earth has a purpose and responds to that purpose in God's plan is a very loose way of saying the natural world is made in a certain way. and we should respect it. But since God gave us some animals to eat and others to work with, whilst asking us to leave others alone for some very good reasons, it's worthwhile noting that God is trying to help every form of life out there. Be it humans, our pets, our livestock, or the wild beasts that roam the earth. Yes, predator-prey relationships play into that, thus making true justice a human-based concept rather than a natural universal law that all creatures must obey and are subject to. But if my studies have shown me anything, as humans, were like that before we heard God's call and responded to it. Adam, as my studies go, was called to the Garden of Eden, and Eve came with him. He wasn't just made and Eve brought out of him. He was called and Eve was taken from him. Noah was the only one to listen to God about a flood and made the ark for his family and the animals to survive. Moses listened to God and wrote down the commandments, leading the Israelites out of Egypt. Jesus had to actually go and remind the people of Israel, about the laws they had forgotten, made light of, or just glossed over completely. The first thing on our minds is always survival. Not even Christ denied that, allowing things to happen on the Sabbath that many people consider completely against what the Sabbath was about. But God helps us with that and gives us more than just that. God helps us survive and gives us a meaning to survive and to grow. Animals who respond to God may die or be injured, but they are helping the world become a better place by being there at the right time for the right purpose. Never let it be said that we are different from the animals, because we are not. As not all of us are willing to listen to God when He calls us. So keep listening, my friends. Stay safe, and God be with you.